We are all done with our project, but before we move on, I want to do a quick recap on the three server primitives that we learned about. So tools, resources, and prompts. In particular, I want to highlight something interesting about each of these, namely what part of an app is really responsible for running each. In other words, in a typical application, who is really running each of these things and who benefits from them? Well, we would say that tools are model controlled. This means that Claude alone is really responsible for deciding when to run a given tool. Resources are app controlled. In other words, some code running inside of your app is going to decide that it needs some data provided by a resource. It will be your app's code that decides to execute a resource and use the return data in some way, maybe by using that data in the UI or something like that. In our case, we fetch a resource and then use that data inside the UI to provide a list of autocomplete options. We also fetch a resource to augment a prompt. Both those things were really application related code that was authored by you and I to put together. And finally, prompts are really user controlled. So a user decides when a prompt is going to run. A user might start the invocation of a prompt by clicking on some UI element, like a button or a menu option, or they might make use of a slash command, which is what we did. The reason I highlight what is controlling each of these is to give you some idea of their purpose. So if you ever need to add capabilities to Claude, you're probably going to want to look at implementing some tools inside of your MCP server or consuming some servers' tools through your MCP client. If you ever want to get some data into your app for the purposes of showing content in the UI or something similar, then you probably want to use a resource. And if you ever want to implement some kind of predefined workflow, you probably want to look at prompts. Now, you can see examples of all these ideas inside of the official Claude interface at claude.ai. So here's what it currently looks like for me. You'll notice that underneath the main chat input are some buttons right here. If I click on one and then click on one of these examples, you'll see that I immediately dive into a chat. So this was a user-controlled action. I, as the user, decided to start up this particular workflow, and I'm making use of a prompt that was probably already written ahead of time and probably has been optimized in some way. So to implement that list of buttons right there, we would probably want to put together a series of different prompts inside of a MCP server. Likewise, if I go back and maybe click on this little tab right here, the plus button, you'll notice that I have a Add from Google Drive button. Now, I'm not going to click on it because it's going to show some of my internal documents, but if I click on that button, I'm going to see some documents that I can add into this chat as some context. Knowing what documents to actually render in that list, and then whenever I click on one, automatically injecting its contents into the context of this chat, that is all application-related code. So it is solely the application that needs to know the list of documents to render here. And that's, again, specifically UI-related elements. So to implement that listing of documents from Google Drive, I would probably look at implementing a resource inside of a MCP server. And then finally, if I enter in a message to this chat of something like, what is square root of 3, use JavaScript to calculate the value, and send it off, I'm clearly expecting Claude to somehow execute some JavaScript code, which would likely be done through the use of a tool. In this case, the decision to use a tool was 100% model controlled. It is the model that decided to use some JavaScript tool execution. To implement something like this inside of a MCP server, we'd likely want to, you guessed it, provide a tool. So in total, that's our three different server primitives. And each one is really intended to be used by a different portion of your overall application. So we got tools, which are generally going to serve your model, resources, which are generally going to serve your app, and prompts, which are going to serve your users. Once again, these are high-level guidelines, and the only reason I mention them is to just give you a sense of when you should use each of these primitives, depending upon what you are trying to put together.